Guys, this is the brand new Max8 G2S, and it's got some pretty cool updates that might make it the best and most convenient ESC for 1/8 scale bashing. Let's check it out. Hobbywing tends to change what they include with their ESCs from time to time. So included with this, we've got the VHB to tape it down, some zip ties, and then this really nice adapter that makes it really easy to mount to a lot of different cars. We also get some stickers, and of course the ESC itself. This Max8 G2S looks very similar to the previous version Max8 G2, although we see a hint of what one of the biggest updates to it is right here. We've got the same sensor connector that they've included on their other G2 vehicles. They went with a proprietary design because the standard sensor cable connector is not waterproof, and this design is waterproof. With that waterproof advantage, of course, the disadvantage is that you cannot remove it, and this connector is specifically designed to work with their motors. However, they did fairly recently come out with an adapter that allows you to connect this to regular motors. Just keep in mind that the temperature sensing functionality is lost if you use one of these adapters. Along with the physical changes they made to this ESC, there are some programmatical changes. We'll check that out in just a minute. We've got some decently long power wires that go to a pair of XT90s. These are genuine AMAS XT90s, so even if you don't end up using these, make sure you save them because these are good connectors. This has the same power button as the new Max6 G2. Inside this button is a Bluetooth module that allows you to program the ESC straight from your phone without needing any type of program box. Unlike the Max6 G2, we still have a fan connector that hopefully will allow us to program it with those program boxes in case you have any problems with Bluetooth, which does happen occasionally. We'll make sure we can program with a program box here in just a little bit. Another thing they changed is the way the fan works. This fan is now an on-demand fan, so it won't be on all the time. Whether or not that's going to affect the temperatures of the ESC is something we'll also find out when we take this thing out and test it. Beyond that, this looks very similar to the original Max8 G2. This is a 160 amp ESC. It's one of the most powerful 6S ESCs you can get. It's hard to see in the video, but these capacitors are Rubicon. Whenever you see good capacitors, it's a sign that the manufacturer cares about the longevity of their devices. Let's take a closer look at this fan and see if anything's physically different about it. Removing the cover, we can see this is the same frameless fan mount design that they were using previously on the Max8 G2. This is actually more durable than their previous versions and mounts directly to the heatsink instead of mounting to the cage above. This does limit your options for replacing the fan internally, but this is a standard fan mount pattern, so you can put a different fan on the outside and just mount it to the outside of the cage. You can also see the epoxy they use for waterproofing. Basically, they put everything inside, then fill this up with epoxy so it's nice and waterproof. Speaking of waterproof, these G2 censored motors are the only truly waterproof censored motors that I'm aware of in the industry. Let me show you what I mean. As you can see, this rear end belt actually has an O-ring that seals out water, and they've sealed all the wires with silicone. That coupled with a sealed front bearing makes this probably the most waterproof motor you can get. Most brushless motors are technically waterproof because they don't really have any electronics in them that are susceptible to water. Of course, the exception to that would be the sensor board. These sensor boards are coated but are technically not waterproof, and the bearings in most of these motors are really not waterproof, so if you get them underwater, they're probably going to get destroyed. Because of that, if you're expecting to be around water a lot, these G2 motors are probably your best bet. I'm really curious to see how this new updated ESC performs. I had a couple of weird hiccups with the previous version, and there's really only one way to find out if it's been fixed. We're going to be putting it in this awesome Ultimate Team Co-Rally Kagama. If you haven't seen my build on this, make sure you check it out after watching this video. Before we can do that though, we've got to do some work to this truck. In the last video, I broke an arm, broke the wing mount, and I broke the battery tray. We've got some new parts here, including supposedly an updated battery tray that looks suspiciously like the one that's already in here, so we'll check it out and see if there's any difference between these two. This is actually the first arm I've ever broken on one of these Team Co-Rally cars. We also bent this shaft a little bit, which we'll straighten out in just a minute. Looks like we bent this pin a little bit too. Shouldn't be too hard to straighten out. Overall, these stock arms are some of the strongest arms in the industry right now. Not only are they really thick and beefy, but they've got these reinforcement rings where the pin goes through that really help strengthen that area. They've also got the same style reinforcement rings that the pillow balls that the Arrma cars do, but fortunately, unlike the Arrma cars, you don't have to take these off to stop the CVDs from falling out. Sometimes people get confused on how these cross pins come out. There's a grub screw in the end of the stub axle here. When you take that grub screw out, it releases tension on that cross pin and it'll slide right out. This grub screw is one of the most commonly stripped fasteners on the car because it gets packed up with dirt and it's thread locked, so make sure you clean the dirt out of that hex, and if it doesn't come off easily, use a little bit of heat on that thread lock. Once that grub screw is loose, that pin should come right out, and then you can remove the axle. As you can see, that's a little bit bent. Let's go ahead and get these two straightened out. And to do that, I'm just gonna take this and put it in a vise, take a piece of pipe, and then visually inspect where the bend is, give it a little bit of a tweak, inspect again, give it another little bit of a tweak, and keep doing that until it gets as straight as possible. It doesn't have to be perfectly straight, and you certainly don't have to replace these parts just because they got a little bit bent. And there we go, that is definitely straight enough. If you don't have a vise, you can achieve very similar results with a block of wood and your foot or a hammer. It's a basher, it doesn't have to be perfect. And we'll just transfer everything from the old arm to the new arm. Don't forget to do that before you put it on because it's a lot easier to move things over while it's still out of the car. Also, make sure you pay attention to where your droop screw is so you can have it adjusted in the same place without having to go through a bunch of work. That looks just about right. Let's get this back together. With strong power tools, doing something like installing one of these pillow balls is pretty easy, but if you don't have power tools, putting some chapstick or even a little bit of grease on those threads can help install it a lot easier. Now we'll just install our freshly straightened pins. You do want to get these pins as straight as possible because if they are crooked, they can cause the arms to bind. A little bit of binding in a basher isn't the end of the world, but it is something you want to try to avoid. Whenever you're threading into aluminum, I always recommend starting by hand because if you're not careful and you're using power tools, if you start cross-threading into the aluminum, it can be really hard to recover from, and you might end up destroying your fancy aftermarket parts. Whenever you're done with a repair that involves an arm, before you put the shock on, just make sure the arm's fairly free so that there's no major binding, which can cause problems with bashing. I'm pretty impressed with how this ADU Racing bumper's been holding up. I kind of expected it to already be broken. This design was actually the inspiration for this custom bumper I made in the last video. If you haven't seen that, check it out because I show you how to make all kinds of custom parts in there, and I've got a pretty cool giveaway I'm doing. In that video, I mentioned some things that don't work well 3D printed. Well, it turns out this is one of them. And I don't necessarily think it's the design's fault. It might have been the material I used or the orientation in which I printed it. But about 30 seconds into bashing, all 4 of these holes ripped out. So we're just gonna go back to the stock one. I don't necessarily expect the stock one to last any longer, but I guess we'll see. All right, let's get this power system swapped out. I would say one of the biggest drawbacks of the Team Co-Rally platform is that it's a bit more complicated to get ESCs in and out of these cars because you do have to take both the receiver box and the battery box out in order to properly route everything. Though unlike me, most of you probably aren't constantly swapping electronics out in your cars, so it's generally not that big of a deal. Another thing to be aware of is sometimes the receiver cables that come with aftermarket ESCs won't be long enough to reach the receiver box, so you have to add an extension. You can see here just how much shorter the Max8 G2 ESC wire is. I'm not entirely sure if this is gonna fit or not without an extension. One really nice thing though is that they use the exact same screw holes, so it'll mount right up to the plate. Before we install it, we need to replace this battery tray. This supposedly is the V2 battery tray, but unless the difference is very, very subtle, or I already had the V2 battery tray, I don't see that this is any different, so it's probably gonna end up breaking too. But we have it, so we might as well swap it out. A quick tip, when you're swapping out battery straps, only do one at a time, that way you have the other one as a reference, because it can be kind of confusing how these are supposed to go sometimes. Another thing you'll discover if you run big or heavy batteries in these Team Co-Rally cars is that the stock battery straps will break. That's why you see 2 upgraded straps here. And I think this wire is going to be long enough to actually reach the receiver box. Let me go ahead and get this installed, then we'll get the motor swapped out. As is often the case with these 6.5mm bullets from Hobbywing, this is almost impossible to put together. If you run into that problem, you can just take a pair of pliers and very carefully squeeze the prongs of the connector in. You don't want to go so far that this is easy to remove and install. You still want it to be hard to install, otherwise it's going to fall out in a crash. But you also don't want it to be so hard to install that you risk ripping the connector out if you ever want to take it back out again. If possible, it's also a really good idea to secure your wires. You would be surprised at how much force can be imparted on these wires in an upside down crash, and if you have all this weight hanging just off the connectors, it can pull them out. And of course, when you forget one of the cables, you can actually reuse these zip ties just by taking your pick, putting it under the little tab, and then pulling the zip tie back apart again. For a nice clean install, the new button does still fit in the old button holder. Throttle calibration is a little bit different because there's no set button. We just hold the power button down until the light starts blinking. Normally the motor would also be beeping, but I've got the motor disconnected so I can talk to you. We just put the throttle in neutral, hit it once, full throttle, hit it again, full reverse, hit hit it a third time, and it should be calibrated. Of course, my motor is going reverse from where it needs to, and because this is a sensored setup, we can't just swap any two wires, so let's check out the programming. To do that, all we need to do is make sure the ESC is on, fire up the Hobbywing Link software, connect to it using the button in the upper right-hand corner. You'll see the Hobbywing ESC listed. Once we're connected, we can go in and change all of the parameters. I just need to reverse the motor direction, but we have a bunch of other parameters we can change here. We also have the ability to look at performance logs as well as live performance data. This live performance data can be handy if you're trying to diagnose a problem with your ESC or car. We also have the ability to update the firmware. This firmware is already up to date, and then we can save and exit. I am curious to see whether or not we can use the regular program boxes on this, so let's go ahead and hook up their latest one and see if it turns on. While I'm getting this hooked up, if you're having a good time, now be a great time to go ahead and get subscribed. We do these kinds of deep dives all the time, as well as bashing and crashing, ultimate upgrades, reviews, and all the latest news that you don't want to miss. Okay, as we can see, this is not working, so unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to use the program box on here. Let's try the old school one and see if it works. No, this isn't working either, so unfortunately, it does look like you're going to be stuck using just Bluetooth to program this new G2S ESC, just like with the Max 6. I'm really curious to see how this setup performs, so let's go find out. All right, first of all, let's see just how fast it is. I suspect we're going to be wheelie limited. Yeah, it's trying to wheelie. Pretty quick though. All right, let's check it. "48 miles an hour, that is not too bad, and that's at about 50% throttle. Any more than that, and it just wants to wheelie. Let's see how she bashes. Ran a couple of packs through it like that, and so far it's holding up really, really well. As you can see, both the motor and ESC are staying nice and cool. I don't even have a fan on this motor, and it still is staying under a dangerous temperature, even though it's pretty hot outside. And the amount of heat these electronics produce is a direct function of how efficient they are. Every bit of heat this is creating is energy not being used to move your car. So far, I'm really happy with this thing. It actually feels better than the original G2 Max8. However, there's one big problem I had with the G2 Max8, and that's when going hard off a big ramp, sometimes it would just shut down for a half a second. So in order to test to see if that's still a problem, let's go hard off a big ramp. Well guys, I didn't notice any of the issues I was having before with the ESC temporarily shutting down, so maybe they fixed that. Overall, I'm really happy with this, and this might be the best bang for the buck bashing setup you can get right now. After coupon, I was able to get this combo for $212 shipped, and that's a really good deal, and I'd recommend getting the combo because Hobbywing seems to be having some problems with their G2 ESCs and sensorless motors, so if you're gonna get this ESC or any of the G2 ESCs, just get their motor to go with it. It's not that much more expensive, and it's definitely worth it. The only real downside downside I see is the programmability of it. You can only program it through Bluetooth. I think they could have easily set this up to still use the program port because it is powered briefly when it starts up, and I know these program ports detect whether or not the box is connected, so it could have just kept it powered up when it detected a box connected to it. That was their decision, and it seems to be the way they're going, so it's something to keep in mind. If you get one of these ESCs, you're only going to be able to program it through your phone. Whether or not you see that as a problem will depend on your personal experience with it. Overall, I highly recommend picking one of these up, and I highly recommend watching one of these videos.